following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Oscar Charleston is best known in the city of brotherly love as the manager of the Negro League Philadelphia Stars, a position he held between 1941 and 1950. But as a player, Charleston set a precedent for the five-tool players who came after him. A power hitter who could hit to all fields and bunt, Charlie, as he was nicknamed, was also extremely fast on the base paths and in center field. He played very shallow, almost behind second base, but his remarkable speed and instinct helped him outrun many batted balls. In addition, he had an arm like a howitzer that enabled him to cut down base runners from any distance. No wonder Buck O'Neill, manager of the storied Kansas City Monarchs, once described Charleston as Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, and Tris Speaker rolled into one, and even better than Willie Mays, whom O'Neill regarded as the greatest major leaguer he had ever seen. For all his talent, however, Charleston never achieved the acclaim of those three baseball legends. Nor does he hold the same notoriety as such Negro League greats as Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. On this podcast, we will explore the life and career of Oscar Charleston. My guest is Jeremy Beer, author of Oscar Charleston, The Life and Legend of Baseball's Greatest Forgotten Player. Jeremy is co-founder and principal partner at American Philanthropic, LLC, which works closely with philanthropies and nonprofit clients in such areas as organizational strategy, board development, program analyses and audits, leadership, and staff training and campaigns. He serves as chairman of the board at the American Ideas Institute and is a member of the development committee for the Society for American Baseball Research. Welcome to the podcast, Jeremy. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Bill. Thanks.
Jeremy, you open your book by telling readers about your serendipitous discovery of several scrapbooks of newspaper clippings on Oscar Charleston's career. These were kept by his wife, Janie, and after her death, passed on to the Negro Leagues Museum in Kansas City. For a historian, this must have been a proverbial gold mine, so you had something that no other historian had. But what was it about Charleston himself that intrigued you so much that you decided to write a bio of him?
Well, when I first heard about Charleston, which was through Bill James's ranking of the top 100 players of all time, in which he ranks Charleston fourth, I started to look into him. I didn't know, who is this man who Bill James ranks the fourth greatest player of all time, and I'd never really heard of, as far as I tell, and many of my baseball-loving friends had the same reaction when I would mention his name. And you would look around online to try to find out what you could about Charleston, and there were two things that were intriguing. One, he's from Indiana, like me, and that just interested me even more. My friends and I from Indiana had always prided ourselves on sort of knowing who the greatest athletes were from our state, and he had escaped our gaze, and that was troubling, and we wanted to do something about that. And the second was that what you'd find online sort of clearly had the marks of mythology, and you'd find one fact sort of garbled from person to person in a game of telephone, from site to site or article to article. So it was clear to me that he hadn't really been taken seriously as a historical figure, and nobody really seemed to know who Oscar Charleston really was. So those were the things that drove me to want to tell his story and find out more about him.
Charleston had a fascinating early life. You point out in your book that he was born and raised in Indianapolis, and as a youngster he was a bat boy for the Indianapolis ABCs. Then at age 15 he enlisted in the military and was sent to the Philippines, where he played baseball with the 24th Negro Infantry. In 1915, still a teenager, Charleston returned to Indianapolis and quickly became a star center fielder for the ABCs. In the next year, he led them to the first of many championships in his career. You attribute such a remarkable youth to the lack of employment opportunities available to a black youth in Indianapolis during the 1910s, but But wasn't there also a desire for adventure and the courage to pursue it?
Oh, sure. I don't think you lie your way into the Army at the age of 15 without a significant amount of courage and a significant desire for adventure. So I think you're entirely right about that. Yeah, Charleston was never one to shy from any kind of challenge. I don't know, and we don't know exactly why he decided to go into the Army at age 15. But he did so, and he got all the adventure he probably wanted in being shipped to the Philippines and starting his professional baseball career there. And it was pretty remarkable right away. That 24th Infantry team that you mentioned had another future Hall of Famer on it, a man named Bullet Joe Rogan. Wasn't known as Bullet Joe at the time. He was just Wilbur Rogan. And he and Charleston formed the battery, the usual battery on that team, one of them pitching and the other catching. Both were selected for an all-star game or two after the end of their first year playing in the professional Manila League there. So, yeah, Charleston, I'm sure you're right, had a significant desire for adventure and took a lot of courage to do what he did, and it certainly set him on a path toward his career in professional baseball.
You know, you mentioned Bullet Joe Rogan, and it astounds me how Negro leaguers tend to find the great talent and find each other. Charleston played for several successful Negro League teams, and one of my favorites was the Hilldale Daisies, and played there from 1928 to 31, and played, I guess, with Judy Johnson there. Then he went on to the Pittsburgh Crawfords later, 1933 to 37, and then 39 to 40, where, you know, he rubbed elbows there with Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige. But his finest season came in 1921, when he was playing for the very little-known St. Louis Giants, a team that only seemed to exist for one season. And that year, Charleston hit well over 400, led the Negro National League in doubles, triples, and homers. He went on to win batting titles in the Eastern Colored League in 1924 and 1925 while playing for the Harrisburg Giants. Jeremy, what do you consider to be his greatest season?
I think you're right. It's either 1921 or 1924. If we just go by the statistics we have available to us today, and in part statistics that were available to people even then, or at least the way he was talked about. 1921, he was 24 years old, very much a rising star in the brand new Negro National League that had just been founded in 1920. He had butted heads with C.I. Taylor, who was the owner-manager of the Indianapolis ABCs. He was the man who signed Charleston to his first Negro Leagues contract and had really mentored him. But Charleston was not always easy to mentor. He had his own. He was very independent-minded and was very stubborn. And we don't know exactly why he and C.I. had a little trouble getting along, but he had slipped away to St. Louis. And whether he had a chip on his shoulder, it was just developing. He had a tremendous year and hit 423 by the latest numbers, and they're still changing, by the way. I get these from Seamheads.com, and Gary Ashwill and his team continue to find box scores and put new stats into the system. But by the latest numbers, 423 with a 499 on-base percentage and a 743 slugging percentage. That's pretty good anywhere. He had 32 stolen bases to that and 101 RBIs in just 82 games. Not many players have had a season like that anywhere. And in 1924, similar numbers with the Harrisburg Giants. That's his first year managing that team, which he really put together. Colonel Struthers was the man who owned that team. He invited Charleston to Harrisburg and put it together. He was going to go to the big time with the new Eastern Colored League. And Oscar hit 405 with a 476 on base and a 780 slugging percentage that year. So that gives you a sense of what Oscar's peak was like. These were towering peaks. These are 14,000, 15,000 foot peaks, if we put it in Rocky Mountain terms. Really, really good.
You know, unlike the white major leagues, where players tended, because of the reserve clause, to stay with one team, the Negro leaguers jumped around. and a lot of that was because of the constant infighting between owners and the poor financial backing of those Negro League teams. I wonder, though, particularly in light of your comments about Charleston's independence, is this why he became a player manager in the mid-1920s, so he could have greater control over his future?
Yeah, possibly. Certainly so that he could have greater control over the teams on which he played. He was simply a natural leader, and by the same token, not a natural follower. I think he knew how, by that time in 1924, even though he was only 27 years old, he knew how he wanted to run a team, and he wanted to be that man. So I don't know. He already had pretty good control over his future because, as you say, there's no reserve clause. Contracts were extremely hard to enforce. There wasn't much trust between owners, and there was rivalry between leagues, and all these things that led to a lot of fluid player movement. So that he sort of already had going for him, but being a player manager meant building a team. I think it was just another challenge for him, and I think he was a big enough believer in himself that he thought he could do it and do it well, even at that young age.
One of the most fascinating parts of your book is your discussion of how Charleston was unfairly branded with the reputation of a thug who had very little self-discipline and a temper, and I quote you here, that periodically drove him beyond the edge of sanity. Now, you're quoting other historians
right.
who said that. And you argue that it really bred a false image of Charleston as a dangerous loose cannon bordering on the psychopathic. And he got that reputation very early in his career. You trace it to a postseason game played in October of 1915 between Charleston's Indianapolis ABCs and a white all-star team. Jeremy, tell us about that game. How did this reputation originate?
Yeah, so he really doesn't have a reputation as a thug or a borderline psychopath or someone with a temper that periodically drove him beyond the edge of sanity. I think those are Mark Grabowski's words. He doesn't actually really have that until his life is over. That doesn't really start until the 70s and 80s when Negro League historians are starting to arise really for the first time and trying to get to know him and sort of misreading the evidence that is out there. During his life, because of the incident that you mentioned, which I'll talk about here in a second, he did have a reputation for having a temper and being someone who was willing to get into fights on the field if circumstances called for it, and would get in umpires' faces and would come into bases hot and so forth. But never a reputation as a thug or psychopath or anything like that, which is one of the things I was able to discover. But that incident in 1915 is very important because that is the one that ultimately led him to have that false reputation. He's very young in 1915. It's his first year in the Negro Leagues. He's just been signed by the ABCs that April and has gone through his first year. And this is October, and there are a series of games played on Sundays between the Indianapolis ABCs, the best black baseball team in Indianapolis, of course, and a rotating cast of white major league and minor league all-stars, a cast that includes Donnie Bush, an Indianapolis native who is now the Detroit Tigers infielder. There's a 3-game series. Each team is 1-1. It's very tense. The press has really played it up from a racial angle, that the white team is going to put the ABCs in their place and that sort of thing. So there's some tension here. And Donnie Bush takes off for second base midway through the game 3 and is called safe. And the second baseman, a man named Bingo DeMoss, is sure he was out. Everybody on the ABC thinks he was out. And DeMoss gets in the umpire's face, and they get into a shoving match. And during that, Charleston, who, as you had mentioned earlier, played a very shallow center field and was backing up the play anyway, comes running in from his position and slugs the umpire in the face, decks him, and all hell breaks loose. Chaos on the field, fans streaming onto the field, police coming onto the field, and Oscar and Bingo end up spending the night in jail, bailed out the next day by one of the co-owners of the team, and they head off to Cuba for a pre-planned tour of the island. So that's Oscar's first breakthrough into public consciousness as somebody who is not always in control of his temper. And really embarrassed C.I. Taylor, his manager, who issued several public apologies and really rides Oscar hard. But it was a very good learning process for him. It's a learning process that you can see taking root more and more as time goes on, and as the testosterone begins to wane perhaps a little bit. But it's interesting. Almost all of his fights, not all of them, but the vast majority are in games against white teams. It seems like those are the games where his intensity ratcheted up even more, and he was already an intense guy. And so that gives you a clue as to what those games meant, probably not just to him, but to his teammates and other black players.
Now, I quote you here on that game, and you write, "For a black man playing in a mixed-race game to slug a white umpire who was already engaged with another black player was to cross any number of lines." End of quote. One of the things I really enjoy about your writing, Jeremy, is that you not only show the reader a scene, as you do very well with that October 1915 game between the white all-star team and the ABCs, but you also have a way of telling your reader insightfully the significance of these episodes. And, you know, showing and telling is a real gift for a writer. And as I am reading your book, I keep on coming back to this comparison of Jackie Robinson before Jackie Robinson. That is, Charleston having the same fire as Jackie Robinson, not only as a competitor, but as a civil rights pioneer. In fact, his contemporaries claimed that Charleston's aggressiveness was second only to Ty Cobb's will to win. Like Cobb, Charleston's temper was known to flare on and off the field. Now, you point out a story which I guess you believe is apocryphal, that Charleston ripped the mask off a KKK member and confronted him to face. So, you know, how far does that analogy go with Jackie Robinson? I mean, is that story true? Were there other incidents where Charleston very proactively defended himself in the face of any racism?
Yeah, good questions. I don't know the truth of the KKK story because it's not told until Cool Papa Bell relates that late in life, I think the 70s or something, and nobody else has that story, and it just seems unlikely to me. And it's not like people were just wearing KKK masks walking down the street. Yeah, I mean, there was something going on when that was happening. So probably not. But it's significant that Bell would attribute to Charleston that action. It tells you what the men at that time thought about him, that he was the sort of man who would do that. If that had happened, you know, or maybe something kind of like it happened, that would have been Charleston who did it. He didn't back down from anyone, and he stood for that in that community. He stood for not backing down, I guess is the way I would say it. You know, he didn't get the chance like Jackie did to play in the Negro League, in the National League or American League. But he symbolized, and you see this in the black press beginning in the teens, but it really starts to gain momentum in the early 1930s when a certain kind of exasperation starts to show up in the black press. He symbolized the injustice of the color line in Major League Baseball. How could they have kept this man out? And they would, a lot of the black journalists at the time would go get quotes from white players about how good Oscar was and others. But Charleston usually was sort of the lead character in all this because he had been the acknowledged all-around best player and most popular player in black baseball for more than a decade. So they'd ask Dizzy Dean, what do you think of Oscar Charleston? You know, or Honus Wagner, what did you think of Oscar Charleston? Or Hank Greenberg. And they'd get quotes from these guys on the record and many others who are less well known. So he stood for that. That was sort of his role in that civil rights question. Even the communist Daily Worker newspaper in 1936 kind of gins up a new effort to challenge organized baseball on the color line, and Oscar lends them his name, at least purportedly lends them his name, along with some others, even in that effort. So he's a true symbol of all that, Bill, I would say, and he was clearly happy to play that role. There's a story of a scout from the Yankees watching him in the early 1930s, and he says to Oscar, "Hey, I would love to sign you. You know, you're so good, I would love to sign you." And Oscar says, "Well, hey, why don't you?" And the scout says, "Well, you and I both know why." And Oscar's like, "Well, you know, that's the end of the story. I mean, why don't you? You know, someone's going to have to be that person." One more story about all this. He seems to have been friends with Jimmy Fox. And there's a story, and this is a cool Papa Bell story, so again, I'm not sure the veracity of it, but apparently there was a game in Mexico one time, and again, a black team playing a white team, and Jimmy Fox's team had benefited from a couple of umpires' bad calls at the end of the game. And they were out to dinner afterwards, and Fox, admitted to Oscar that they had gotten that the black team had gotten the raw end of the deal. And Charleston said, "Yeah, I appreciate that. You've always been a friend to us. You know, a lot of guys aren't, but you've always been good with us, you know, Jimmy." So I don't know. There's evidence that he took it very seriously, you know, and appreciated white players and observers who were unprejudiced, and challenged those who were. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you often wonder, where were these white major leaguers when, the color barrier could have been broken? Where was their courage then? Even Connie Mack supposedly said to Judy Johnson he would have signed him, right. But, it just wasn't in the cards as long as you had Kennesaw Mountain Landis as a commissioner.
Yeah. It took a lot of courage. I don't like to be too hard on those guys. I mean, it's easy for us now to say where were they. I will say, in my research, I was surprised at how many white major leaguers spoke up, if asked anyway, as early as the 1930s, and were willing to say on the record, "Heck yeah, these guys could play." It's not my decision or whatever, but yeah, they could play. They're as good as us. So. In a way, I was sort of more encouraged by that than I would have expected to be before I did the book.
Mm-hmm. You also point out that Charleston was intellectually curious, and that is pretty exceptional of any professional baseball player exactly. Back at that period of time. And he also seems to be socially hypergamous. I mean, he marries well. He marries the daughter of a Protestant minister who was also intellectually curious, tough-minded, strong-willed, and practical, much like Charleston himself. But Charleston also appears to have been a ladies' man, and that resulted in a separation between he and his wife. Tell us about their relationship, Jeremy.
Yeah, Oscar was everything you just said, and so was Janie. Her name is Janie Blaylock. He met her. It's not clear where he met her. She said in North Carolina. I can't ever place them both in North Carolina, but that's certainly possible. 1923 or 1924. And it was a weird relationship, but a whirlwind romance. Janie had done college work post high school to get her teacher's certificate. She was teaching in the Harrisburg public schools. She had been married already to one of Harrisburg's most socially ambitious and advanced young black men, but he had died of the influenza, I think in 1919 or so. So she was already a young widow. Charleston only had an 8th grade education, but he actually had been married before himself as well, also to a woman of good family in Indianapolis, a woman whose father was a principal of a school in Indianapolis and been a Booker T. Washington student, and a mother who was a sort of a celebrated musician and music lessons teacher. So he had a pattern, and he didn't really fit Janie's pattern, but he must have been very charming. He must have been very well-spoken and charismatic. And so they eloped because her father never would have given permission for them to be married. And they end up having, it was a relationship troubled by Charleston's lapses, probably infidelity. We're reading between the lines there, but there's enough evidence for us to probably think that was the case. Janie wasn't much of a baseball fan. She didn't mix well with others. I think Double Duty Radcliffe or one of those guys said at some point. And she was sort of bored by baseball. But there were other things that kept them together, even though Charleston's life was baseball. They, for instance, in Cuba in the winter, where Oscar played baseball every year, they charmed the press. There'd be pictures of them together when they would disembark from the boat in Havana from Key West. They became sort of they appear to have become sort of members of what's called the Afro-Cuban elite. There was sort of this interchange between higher social scale African Americans between Cuba and America, and they befriended business people and a woman named Margaret Martin, who was a writer for W.E.B. Du Bois's magazine Crisis. And so they had this sort of, it was not the social life that you would necessarily think a ball player and his wife would have. It was a sort of grace to it, and it's sort of a social ambition to it. The term talented tenth has been used in sort of describing African American society. I think Charleston had ambitions to belong to that. That's my read on him from the scrapbook, from the photo album, from the newspaper articles of the time. That he thought, that's something he could belong to. He was socially ambitious in the best sense. And it's interesting to think about what he might have been like that today, who'd had educational opportunities that he didn't have, and certainly social opportunities that he didn't have. But he certainly seems to have done the best with what he did have.
And he certainly seems to have had a very impressive career. In the appendices to your book, you list the stats that he compiled over a 30-year playing career. Now, thanks to SABR and its various committees, the Negro League statistics are we have a much better grasp of them than we did, let's say, even 10 or 15 years ago. So these stats that I'm quoting from your appendices are up to date and as accurate as they can possibly be. During that 30-year span, Charleston hit .352 with a slugging percentage of .547 and an on-base percentage of .446. He collected 373 doubles, 150 triples, 209 home runs, and 1,264 RBIs, while also stealing 358 bases. This is a five-tool player, too, considering, his fielding expertise and the strength of his arm. Now, you also write, as you mentioned earlier, that Bill James considers Charleston the best Negro leaguer of all time and the fourth best player of all baseball players, white, black, or Latino. Only Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, and Willie Mays ranked higher. Jeremy, how do Charleston's stats compare with those other three Hall of Famers?
Yeah, that's something I thought about quite a bit. Of course, it's hard you can't just, pick up Negro League statistics, even the ones we now have, which, as you say, have gotten a lot better, and just, plop them into the American League or National League context. But if you do just a little bit of reasonable, logical maneuvers and discounting, they hold up tremendously well. So, for instance, first of all those counting statistics you mentioned, those were compiled in fewer than half the number of plate appearances that Willie Mays had, for instance. So if you just double all of those to kind of give him the same number of plate appearances that Mays had in his career, and there's no reason to think that Charleston would have been less durable than Mays. He was incredibly durable. That gives you some sense of where he might have ended up. Maybe 400 home runs and 700 stolen bases or something crazy like that. But I think you need to do a little bit of discounting. Negro League teams were very, very good. They didn't have as much depth, generally speaking, as American League and National League teams did. And so most players, when they made the move over, say like Monty Irvin or Larry Doby, saw their statistics diminish a little bit. Not a ton, but a little bit. And so I did just a little bit, just using Baseball Reference's play index, sort of build an alternative Major League Oscar to sort of try to answer your question. And if you give him, let's see, what do I say I want to give him? My alternative Oscar would have something like an OPS plus of 140, so that means an on-base plus slugging percentage of 40% better than the average. It was 174 or so in the Negro leagues. I give him 250 career home runs, give him 400 career stolen bases, and make him an above replacement defender. So defensive wins above replacement, above zero. I think all of those are like unquestionably numbers he would have achieved in the major leagues. Only one other player has done that, and that's Barry Bonds, who probably had a little chemical help in achieving it. So there's been nobody like him, really, who had the hit tool, the power, and the speed, and the defensive chops. Just looking at the numbers like that, there's been nobody like him. So I think it did compare favorably to just about anybody.
Yeah. When you hear Buck O'Neil say that, he's better than Willie Mays, and I like that comparison that you gave us. It really gives you pause. What if this guy did have the same number of plate appearances? I mean, could he have been far and away the best baseball player ever? I mean, ever, even looking at today's players and some of the phenomenal numbers they put up. And as you say, and from what I understand from your book, he was extremely durable. And the knock against a lot of those guys is that they lived hard, so they weren't as in shape as today's players. Mm-hmm. But that would not be the case with Charleston. So it really makes you wonder how good would he have been had he had more plate appearances.
And let's not forget that in the off season he made himself into a legend in Cuba. He played something like 10 straight years in the 20s in Cuba and became a legend down there, and has one of the best careers ever seen in Cuba in the Cuban League. So he's got an off season worth of being sort of a Hall of Famer all on its own, frankly, just for what he did in Cuba. So it's pretty remarkable.
Jeremy, you mentioned that in 1932, Charleston joined the Pittsburgh Crawfords as a player manager and managed what many baseball historians consider to be the finest Negro League team of all time. And that team featured 5 future Hall of Famers, including Charleston himself, Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, Judy Johnson, and Satchel Paige. How did Charleston get along with those other players? I mean, he got some tremendous ego on that team, and he's the manager.
Yeah, you're right. He sure did. Now, he helped form that team. So he's playing with the Homestead Grays in 1931, and Gus Greenlee, who is the owner of the Pittsburgh Crawfords at that time in 1931, still essentially a semi-pro team that had sort of developed from the Sandlots in Pittsburgh. Gus Greenlee was the numbers king of Pittsburgh. He was a mobster who ran the illegal street lottery there, and it was a popular figure and a glamorous and charismatic sort of figure. And he wanted a real baseball team to go big time for various reasons, possibly to launder some money from the street lottery. And so in 1932, he decides he's going to go all in. And in 1931, he discovered a pitcher named Satchel Paige in Cleveland. He was not yet a star at all, but he came over to Pittsburgh in late 1931 and did well for Greenlee. And that was sort of the beginning of the new Crawfords. But he brought in Charleston to be his manager. He lured him over from the Grays, and Oscar really had a huge hand in putting together the team. He convinces Josh Gibson to come over from the Grays. Judy Johnson comes over probably from Hilldale, I can't remember at the time. Cool Papa Bell and some others. It's a star-studded team. And so Charleston put it together. He did not always get along super well with everybody. Judy Johnson apparently wasn't a big fan. He's one of the very few guys who late in life said negative things about Oscar. And Page didn't say much about him. Gibson, of course, you don't have like extensive, interviews or a memoir from or anything. And Page had trouble remembering anybody's name, including probably his own children. So that's not terribly surprising. But a lot of the other fellows on the team really did like Oscar and really respected him. And a lot of the memoirs you read about that time, there's a lot about how he helped form them and bond them as a team, how he stood up for them in front of, in one case, in front of sort of an angry mob in some baseball park in the South during one of their preseason barnstorming tours. So, yeah, there were a lot of egos in that team, for sure. And in fact, that 1932 team kind of disappointed. They did not have the best record. It was a sort of independent team. They weren't in any particular league at that time. But they still didn't have the best record. I know they got beat by the Homestead Grays in the season series, which was kind of embarrassing. But later Crawford's teams really turned it on under Oscar until they win the Negro Leagues World Series in 1935. So, yeah, that's a really fascinating period. So many egos jockeying there. And you really see the baton being passed in terms of popularity from Oscar to Satchel and Josh, especially Satchel, in, say, 1933 and 34. And from what you can tell, he handles it with grace. He always is. He's always pumping up Satchel in the press. Not that Satchel needed it, even until late in his career. Page comes back and joins the Philadelphia Stars to do some barnstorming when Charleston's managing that team. Charleston praises him when he goes to the Indians and says he's going to do a great job. So, those weren't men that didn't like each other or anything like that, but they were diametrically opposed personalities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the 1940s, you point out that Charleston scouted the Negro Leagues for Branch Rickey, the president of the Brooklyn Dodgers. In fact, Rickey makes him the manager of his Brown Dodgers team, and no one really knew what was going on because Charleston could go freely into Negro League clubhouses and such. Now, according to legend, Charleston was the one to identify Jackie Robinson, but you dispute that. What was his role in the integration of baseball?
Yeah, so in 1945, Gus Greenlee, whom we just talked about, decides to get back in the game of Negro Leagues baseball. He's been out for a while. And he and some associates start a new league called the United States League. Now, there already are two Negro Leagues, and integration is more than just a rumor now. There's political pressure for it. The war has proven, whites and blacks fight side by side. It just seems like that's going to crack any day. So it was kind of an odd time to start a new black baseball league, but they did. And they brought on Oscar to manage the league's Philadelphia entry, actually. And so this is a big story in the black press. At the same time, Branch Rickey is trying to execute his plan of signing black players for the Dodgers. He wants to get a jump on the competition, and and when talent starts filtering back after the war, he's going to be ahead of everybody else. And but he has a problem, as you say. Rickey and his scouts can't go scout games between black teams without drawing attention to themselves. It's what are you doing here, right? And so he connects with the United States League people, and all of a sudden there's a team in Brooklyn called the Brooklyn Brown Dodgers, and Oscar Charleston is no longer set to manage the Philadelphia team. He's now managing the Brooklyn team. And what seems to have been the case is that Rickey wanted that to be the case. Clyde Sukforth, his lead scout, later tells the Sporting News and others, including, I think, Peter Gallenbach, that the Dodgers used Charleston to scout black players for them, including Roy Campanella, whom Charleston famously told them was as young as he said he was. The Dodgers were skeptical that a kid as big and powerful as Campanella could have been as young as he was. And so they signed Campanella in large part on Oscar's advice, and I think several others of the first black players signed by the Dodgers, people who kind of are forgotten today, but if they had made it, wouldn't be forgotten like Johnny Wright and Roy Partlow and some of those others. I think Charleston probably did a lot of background work on them because he knew those fellows pretty well. So, yeah, I think the evidence suggests that Charleston was the first African-American to be paid to scout for a Major League Baseball team. I think he broke the scouting color line.
Mm-hmm. Charleston managed, as you point out, as late as 1954 when he led the Indianapolis Clowns to a league championship. That fall, he suffered a stroke and died. He was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1976. Now, just to recap here, this is an individual who cut across many roles in baseball. He's starting as a bat boy, but a phenomenal player whose stats rival top Hall of Famers. Then he becomes a very successful player-manager, and he becomes a very successful scout. Why is he baseball's most forgotten? Wait, let me get this straight. Why is he baseball's greatest forgotten player? In other words, why did he never achieve the same notoriety of a Page or a Gibson, who we consider the penultimate Negro League players?
Mm-hmm. That is the question. And all I'll answer. There are a few converging factors, I think, that combine to sort of bury Charleston's reputation, which at one time was, as I've stated, undeniably high, at least in the African-American community and certainly among the white baseball players and fans who saw him. But so Page is a unique personality, to say the least. And, of course, he goes on to play in the major leagues, wins Rookie of the Year. What is he, 41 or 42 years old when that happened? So it's obvious why Page would be remembered, and he continues to live on until pretty late in life and gives numerous interviews and writes a famous memoir and he has so quotable. So Page, okay, he's in his own category. The question, why is Josh Gibson, though, remembered more? Well, Gibson got mentioned by Page in part. Gibson was Page's battery mate, and also Gibson was part of a later generation of players, a generation that was more documented by whites in particular. So, Gibson and Leonard, that famous Homestead Grays duo in the 40s. Gibson dies in sort of tragically, and he just had the good luck of getting a biographer early on. I think the 1970s is when we had the first Gibson bio, and there's another one a little bit later. So Gibson sort of gets mythologized. He's also got the power, the Babe Ruth, hit more home runs than Babe Ruth claim going for him. So those are some of the advantages that those guys had. And Cool Papa Bell has a snappy nickname, although nobody really knows anything about Cool Papa Bell other than the nickname that he was fast. He also figures in Satchel Paige anecdotes, which helps him. When you think about it, though, we don't really know any of the players. I mean, mainstream baseball fans, or much less the larger public, they don't know much about any of the guys who played their entire careers in the Negro Leagues. They have still been left in the shadows. And so partly that's part of the reason. Oscar's just one of them. Another reason, he left no descendants. He died in 1954, having had no children. So there was no one to tend his flame. His family, like Oscar himself, not the sort of self-promoting types, and they never sort of took ownership of his reputation. Third, because he died so young, no one was able to interview him when historians and researchers finally got around to wanting to document the Negro Leagues and tell its story in the 1970s and 1980s. And fourth, the players they were able to talk to, especially as time goes on into the 90s and 2000s, well, those players hadn't really played with Oscar, certainly not during his prime. They had played with him maybe at the end of his career, or maybe they had played for him as a manager. So their memories of him were also kind of based on secondhand information, at least as a player in his prime. They were able to tell people, boy, people said Oscar Charleston was fantastic, but they may not have seen him in his prime. So a lot of those things together, and something we've already mentioned, we didn't have good statistics. This is very ironic, until recently. We've gotten better statistics as time has gone on. and everything's been digitized in terms of newspapers, and it's just easier to find things. So if you said Oscar Charleston was great, even when he died in 1954, there was really no way to check it. There was no baseball register to check. There was certainly obviously you couldn't go online to check it. I think people had a hard time believing it. But I think now you can look at everything much more whole, and you can see that it's all true. And James was right. And maybe the 21st century will be Oscar's time if the latter half of the 20th wasn't.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's such a wonderful book, and I know it's your first baseball book, but you can't help but learn a lot about the Negro Leagues, which, really are a lost part of the game. I don't know if you have anything on the back burner right now, or if you were to write another book on a Negro Leagues player, who would it be? I mean, do you have any interest in doing it?
I do. I'm not sure yet, though. It's a good question. I think I don't think Gibson has received the biography he deserves, and maybe somebody out there is working on that. So that might be something I would be interested in doing, but I would just love to see there be more full biographies, period, whoever writes them, of people like John Henry Lloyd, who is sort of the Honus Wagner of his time, and Martin Dihigo, the two-way player from Cuba who was, Shohei Ohtani, right? But over a long length of time. There are so many men whose stories deserve to be told in full, and I think we have the data now, and you can get the clippings and the articles. I hope that somebody, if it's not me, writes a dozen more full biographies of these guys, so we can learn more about who they were and their times and their places.
Now, did you find that there was much audio, either at the Negro Leagues Museum or Cooperstown?
There's no audio. Yeah, as far as I can tell, of Oscar, there's no audio. He did do a WGN radio interview, I know, and before the first Negro Leagues East-West game, that was the All-Star game, in 1933, I want to say, 33 or 34. I know he and Willie Foster, Rube Foster's half-brother, did spots on WGN. That's gone, apparently. A researcher prior to me confirmed that. There's no video that I know of. Somebody else there knows of anything, please let me know. But I didn't find anything, and nobody I knew or contacted has anything. So that's disappointing. But somewhere in somebody's attic,
yeah.
I bet there's something. Yeah.
You better believe it.
Right.
We've been speaking with Jeremy Beer, author of Oscar Charleston, The Life and Legend of Baseball's Greatest Forgotten Player, published by the University of Nebraska Press earlier this year. You can find the book at your local Barnes & Noble's bookstore, as I know firsthand, or online at Amazon Books, or even on the University of Nebraska Press website. Jeremy, thanks for being with us, and good luck with the book. It really is very well done.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.